Let me begin by saying, Dumelang Batsai, o Suilejan, Kaya Suilejan Klekei Tumalelakitang. What? Now, for those of you who aren't fluent in Setswana, and let's be honest, most of us aren't, I just said, hello everyone, how are you? I'm fine, and I'm so happy to be here tonight. So at this point, we have exactly two options. The first, I can continue my speech in Setswana. And the second, I can be chill with yo homies and rap the rest of this oratory. The first option leaves you completely confused and alienated. And the second option leaves you completely confused and alienated. So perhaps for the benefit of all involved, and I know you'd probably want me to continue in English. It makes your lives a whole lot easier. But I'd much rather use the Setswana that I learned this past summer in Africa. So why don't we try to find the middle ground? A compromise. A grand bargain, if you will. Something so rare, but, you know, pretty easy in the main things. So let's try to find that middle ground. So I'll continue not in Setswana, but in Oratory Swana. You see, it's a strange language filled with self-deprecating humor and odd metaphors, spoken in classrooms and in cafeterias, much like this one, all across America, by tribes of neatly groomed students competing for small trinkets with plastic golden women on top of them. But in all seriousness, compromise yields results. It builds coalitions and it allows for future progress. So today, let's examine how our society was built on compromise and how today we ignore the values of our founders. Then we'll learn how other cultures around the world make compromise more than just a platitude. And finally, we'll figure out how we can all stop haranguing and get to work. Now, as you heard, I know a little Setswana. I learned it this past summer during my homestay in the small rural village of Mohobani, Botswana. My host mother, Masaidi Malloy, taught me the phrase Rre Gare Legae, which means between our homes. Saidi explained that it is customary in Botswana, when you invite someone into your home, that you go out and meet them halfway. Literally, between our homes. Saidi explained that something that I realized after a couple weeks in Botswana, that the people in Botswana that I met personified this tradition. They not only were willing to compromise with one another, but went out of their way to do so. So after a couple weeks, I started thinking, if they could do it in Botswana, why couldn't we do it here? In her 2011 Washington Post article entitled The Deals of Their Times, Dr. Margaret Reed explains how the great political compromises have left an indelible mark on our society. The Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights were all the greatest compromises of their time, because our founding fathers understood the value of compromise and the necessity of consensus. So the real question is, if they could do it all those years ago, why can't our current leaders do it now? There is another Setswana proverb, Po hadinipedi mosakeng. Two bulls can't occupy the same corral. It's almost impossible for two aggressively dominant animals to coexist. Sound familiar? The Democrats and the Republicans, the left against the right, liberals and conservatives, we're constantly reminded by the talking heads and the political pundits that our leaders are no longer capable of compromise. But all this talk doesn't hold water. Because in a 2010 Washington Post interview, Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin stated that our leaders fundamentally believe in compromise. However, today their definition of it is their opponents accepting their solutions wholesale. Goodwin goes on to explain how our leaders must govern like the American people live their lives, looking for those areas where there's room to compromise. And by doing so, small but meaningful achievements will be made. Now, although our founding fathers lived in a time very different than our own, people and cultures around the world still believe in compromise, and their values are far from dead. These people and these entire nations survive without conflict for the sake of conflict. So really we have to ask ourselves, how do they make consensus the cornerstone of their lives? The active participation of a nation's citizens is essential to making sure that compromise is a rule, rather than the exception when it comes to governmental policy. In his study, The Critical Role of Post-Colonial Policy, Scott Bouillet, a research analyst at George Mason University, explains how those nations which recognize the vital role of the people's voice generally are more stable and more democratic. Bouillet goes on to explain a practice which, I'm proud to say, I witnessed firsthand this past summer in Africa. He states that in Botswana, the people have built a working democracy based on the ancient tribal tradition of local gatherings called hotlas, which resemble New England town meetings. Now, although I found out later that these meetings are voluntary, I realized that they were some of the most meaningful and interesting social events. I mean, who needs junior prom when you and the whole family can get together and go discuss municipal manure allocation policies with all your friends and neighbors? But seriously, these meetings are important because they allow a nation to be more democratic, and they also allow the people to hold their leaders' feet to the fire and hold them to account. And the leaders aren't allowed to engage in any ideological grandstanding, because the rules of the hotlas demand that if a stalemate is reached, the chief must yield to the will of the people. Thus, when he's formulating policy, the chief actively engages his opponents, rather than be overruled later on. In Europe, liberal and conservative parties often form grand coalition governments, because despite their political differences, their voters simply won't tolerate the kind of ideological and partisan bickering and gridlock which we in the United States see as the norm. So let's all stand up, join hands, and sing Kumbaya with the other nations of the world. Anybody? No? Brian? Well, if singing and dancing won't be the solution to our problem, how are we going to find that common ground? We have to understand that Americans, when we hear the word compromise, we generally shiver and shake with fear, because we've been taught to equate compromise with the losing, or not getting what we want. In a 2010 Psychology Quarterly editorial, it stated that when Americans are presented with factual information during an argument that contradicts their beliefs, they're more likely to reject it and further entrench themselves in those beliefs going forward in their debate. Because Americans will say things that fly in the very face of reason, just for the sake of winning an argument. However, after an argument is over, and Americans are given the opportunity to calmly and rationally analyze what the other side has said, a lot of times they come to the same conclusion, that, yeah, although I don't agree with my opponent's statements, he's making a lot of sense. And this leads Americans to be more moderate and more willing to compromise later on. So, all of us need to understand that politics isn't a sport or a soap opera. We need to give our leaders the room that they need to compromise with one another, and always be right there to hold their feet to the fire, because anything but compromise is simply unacceptable. We the people have to step back, calm down, and take a minute to see what the other side is saying, because by doing so we can sort through all the rhetoric, see which parts of their arguments are drivel, and which parts make a lot more sense than we'd ever like to admit. And by doing this, we can do as it is done in Botswana. We can meet between our homes, each compromising a little in order to achieve something great for our society. And you know what? Maybe today we don't need to go all the way to Africa to solve our problems. I'll save you on the airfare. We can look to the words of the American country band Diamond Rio, which said, "We'd gain a lot of ground if we each give a little. Ain't no road too long if we meet in the middle." Rre Gare Legae. Thank you.